In 1932, in the terraced streets of Jarrow, County Durham, a miner's wife set a clay pot on a coal range and fed her family of 6 on 14 shillings a week. She was not following a recipe. She was not consulting a cookbook because the kitchen she worked in, stone-floored, north-facing, smelling of coal dust and rendered fat, had never produced anything that warranted one. She was solving a problem with the only tools available: dried pulses, a marrow bone, a handful of oats, foraged greens from the back lane, and knowledge passed mouth to mouth through kitchens that never appeared in any published volume, because the women who held that knowledge never imagined it was worth writing down. That was the first erasure. The second came later, quieter, dressed in cellophane and fluorescent light. British households today discard an estimated £730 worth of food every single year, and the meals that once prevented that waste, meals that also science now confirms across multiple independent studies, protected the heart with a precision no supplement has since replicated, are so completely forgotten that most people alive today have never heard their names spoken in a kitchen. The irony sits at the center of everything that follows. These meals were born of shame. They were survival food, poverty food, the food you ate when the butcher had nothing left on the slab and the rent was already 3 weeks late. And that very poverty, the forced reliance on oats, pulses, fish scraps, foraged greens, offal and root vegetables, gave them a cardiovascular profile that modern cardiologists now deliberately engineer into therapeutic diets at considerable expense. Scarcity built the habit. Abundance killed it entirely. To understand exactly how that happened, you have to go back to 1929 and the kitchens that history chose to forget. Number 16 is barley broth, and it begins with a marrow bone that cost 2 old pence at the butcher's scrap counter in the Durham coalfields in the years when the coal industry was already dying and households around it were learning to survive on arithmetic rather than appetite. A miner's wife, recorded in Women's Institute circulars from the period as the keeper of the household economy, would drop that bone into an iron pot alongside a cup of dried pearl barley, a roughly cut swede, and cold water, then set it over a low coal flame for 3 hours. The barley swelled. The liquid thickened to something that held its shape on a spoon. 6 people ate from that single pot across 4 days, and the total cost did not reach a shilling. What she did not know was that the beta-glucan soluble fiber in pearl barley is now one of the most rigorously documented cholesterol-lowering compounds in nutritional science. They called it poor man's soup. Cardiologists now call it a beta-glucan delivery system. Number 15 is herring roe on toast, and it comes from the harbour towns of Grimsby and Lowestoft, where the fishing industry processed vast catches and discarded the soft roe as a near-worthless byproduct. A fishwife or harbourside cook would collect that roe for almost nothing, pan-fry it in the thinnest scrape of dripping on a cast-iron pan until just set, pile it onto hard toast, and serve it as a complete meal. Board of Trade Fisheries records document herring roe as a low-value processing remainder. Nutritional research conducted decades later confirmed that soft herring roe carries an omega-3 fatty acid profile directly linked to reduced blood triglycerides and arterial inflammation. The part of the fish they threw away was the part that protected the heart. Number 14 is oatmeal porridge with black treacle, and it belongs to the mill towns of Lancashire, Bolton, Oldham, the grey streets of the textile belt, where pinhead oatmeal cost 3 pence per pound and required proper cooking rather than the mere addition of hot water. A mill worker's wife, documented in interwar domestic science textbooks as the manager of a household budget with almost no margin, would cook it in an iron pot with water and salt alone, then add black treacle, not golden syrup, not white sugar, but the dark, dense, iron-heavy, polyphenol-rich residue of the cane refining process, which cost almost nothing and added sweetness and micronutrients simultaneously. The beta-glucan in the oats and the polyphenols in the treacle operate through 2 entirely independent cardiovascular mechanisms. It wasn't breakfast. It was medicine disguised as poverty. Number 13 is peas pudding, and Tyneside sold it from barrows pushed along the street by vendors whose names appeared in Newcastle newspaper columns as fixtures of the working district. Yellow split peas soaked overnight, wrapped in muslin and boiled alongside a ham joint, then turned out cold and dense into a pudding basin that sat on the larder shelf for days. It was high in soluble fiber, high in plant protein, carrying no saturated fat worth measuring. Then the street food vanished, and with it vanished the daily habit of eating pulses, a habit that would have protected a generation from what was coming. Number 12 is lentil and vegetable hot pot, and it carries the work of Marguerite Patton, the home economist and broadcaster who worked for the Ministry of Food during the rationing years, and whose BBC home service broadcasts reached millions of households with the news that feeding a family without reliable meat was possible and could be done with dignity. Red lentils, turnip, carrot, a bay leaf, an enamel casserole dish, the lentils swelling across an hour until the pot fed a family across 4 days when the meat ration ran short, which was most weeks. The soluble fiber in red lentils and the potassium in root vegetables act on blood pressure and cholesterol through separate biological pathways simultaneously. When the meat ran out, the lentils went in. Decades later, doctors wished they had stayed. Number 11 is dripping toast with raw onion, and here the story twists in a direction nobody raised on the post-war consensus around dietary fat would expect. The industrial Midlands ate dripping toast through the 1930s as a matter of daily course. Thick-cut bread spread with beef dripping and laid with rings of raw onion, sharp and entirely uncooked, placed directly on top. Mass observation domestic studies conducted in Birmingham recorded it as an unremarkable working household meal. The modern reading is immediate. Dripping is saturated fat, and the story ends there. But the preparation mattered. Properly clarified dripping, skimmed and rested until the fat separated from the dark jelly of bone-derived liquid below, carried a measurably different fatty acid composition from raw, unrendered animal fat. And the raw onion delivered quercetin intact, an anti-inflammatory flavonoid studied extensively for its role in modulating LDL oxidation in the arterial wall. Everyone remembers the dripping. Nobody remembers that the onion was the point. Number 10 is watercress soup from the chalk stream beds of Hampshire and Wiltshire, where watercress grew in clear running water and was sold at town markets at prices Depression-era households could reach without difficulty. A market woman would take a bundle of freshly cut watercress, simmer it into a bone stock thickened with a single waxy potato, and ladle it into a china bowl. Watercress contains isothiocyanates, compounds now linked in multiple nutritional studies to arterial health and the suppression of oxidative stress in vascular tissue. The potassium acts directly on blood pressure regulation. Hampshire Agricultural Society records document watercress as an ordinary commercial crop, priced for ordinary people. They grew it in chalk streams and sold it for pennies. Now it costs £3 a bag and nobody makes the soup. Number 9 is sardine and potato pie from the fishing communities of Cornwall and Devon, where the pilchard catch sustained entire coastal villages, and the tinned version cost 4p and kept for months on a larder shelf. A Cornish fishing household, documented in Women's Institute Cornwall branch recipe circulars, would open a tin of sardines and retain every drop of the oil, fold it through mashed potato, press the mixture over the fish in an enamel pie dish, and bake it until golden. That oil contained EPA and DHA, the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids responsible for the most significant cardiovascular benefits of oily fish. Draining it, as later recipes instructed, removed the primary mechanism of protection. Retaining it added potassium and vitamin D alongside the omega-3, building 3 separate heart-protective mechanisms into a meal costing less than 6p. Every recipe written after 1960 told you to drain the oil. That was the mistake. Number 8 is leek and oat gruel from the South Wales mining valleys, where Rhondda and Aberdare communities grew leeks on allotment strips behind their terraced houses as a survival strategy because the allotment cost almost nothing and the leek asked very little in return. Oatmeal and leeks went into a clay pot with salted water and nothing else, cooked low and long until the oatmeal thickened the liquid and the leek softened entirely into it. The allicin released from cooked leeks acts on cholesterol synthesis through a pathway entirely independent from the beta-glucan mechanism in the oatmeal, meaning these 2 ingredients lower cardiovascular risk through 2 separate channels simultaneously. They ate this because it was cheap. They stopped because it seemed backwards. The science caught up 50 years too late. And here the larger story shifts because this is where the enemies enter the frame physically. A supermarket opens on the high street. Refrigerated display counters appear where the fishmonger's bench once stood. Processed pork, white bread, and tinned goods in sweetened sauce are stacked on shelves and marketed as the food of a nation that has finally escaped hardship. The cardiovascular disease rates in former industrial towns, Durham, Jarrow, Rhondda, Oldham, climbed steadily through the 1960s and into the 70s. The upgrade was the trap. Number 7 is bread and scrape with Marmite, a Depression-era daily meal so entirely ordinary it was never given a formal recipe because nobody imagined that spreading Marmite on bread required instruction. Thick-cut bread, a scrape of margarine reduced to near invisibility, and Marmite applied generously, dark, savory, smelling of the brewery byproduct that it was. Marmite, distributed through wartime supply channels in documented quantities, contained high concentrations of B vitamins, among them niacin, vitamin B3, clinically proven to raise HDL cholesterol, the protective fraction that removes LDL from the arterial wall and returns it to the liver. Wartime school nutrition reports noted its dietary value without fully understanding the lipid mechanism involved. The supplement industry now sells niacin capsules for £12 a bottle. The Depression version was free with the bread. Number 6 is sheep's heart stuffed with oatmeal. From the Scottish borders and the harder reaches of northern England, where a whole sheep's heart cost 3 pence at the butcher and was considered offal in the precise sense, the part sold to households that could not afford the cuts at the front of the counter. Scottish domestic science textbooks and Scottish Women's Rural Institute records include the preparation without apology. The heart cleaned, the cavity packed with oatmeal moistened with stock and seasoned with dried herbs, tied with butcher's twine and placed in a baking tin for the better part of 2 hours, the kitchen filling slowly with a smell that was nothing like poverty. Cardiac muscle is among the leanest cuts of any animal, very low in saturated fat and high in iron and coenzyme Q10. The oatmeal stuffing contributed soluble fiber throughout. The cardiovascular profile of this preparation surpasses that of modern minced beef by every clinical measure available. Heart disease killed millions in the generation that stopped eating heart. Number 5 is nettle and potato broth, which cost nothing because the nettles came from the hedgerow at the end of the back lane. Rural households across England and Wales through the 1930s and 40s gathered young nettle tops each spring, the first 6 inches of new growth when the sting is weakest and the nutrient concentration highest, and simmered them with waxy potato in whatever vegetable stock the week had produced, ladled into bowls with an enamel ladle that had hung beside the range for 20 years. Women's Institute rural recipe archives document nettle cookery as an unremarkable seasonal habit. Nettles are high in iron, potassium, and plant sterols, and anti-inflammatory compounds in the leaf have since been confirmed across multiple nutritional studies. The hedgerow was the pharmacy. The foraging generation never had a name for what they were doing, because they called it dinner. Number 4 is boiled salt cod with parsley liquor from the London East End and coastal market towns, where Billingsgate trade records document dried salt cod as a cheap, stable, storable protein source through the 1920s and 30s. The cod was submerged in cold water for a full 48 hours. The water changed several times to draw the salt out gradually, then boiled gently and laid in an earthenware bowl over which parsley liquor was poured, a source of parsley, corn flour, and pale cooking liquid from the eel stalls that stood nearby in the dense, loud geography of the East End market. Cod carries very low saturated fat and a meaningful omega-3 profile, even dried and reconstituted. Parsley is among the highest folate-containing herbs in the British culinary tradition, and dietary folate is linked directly in cardiovascular literature to reduced circulating homocysteine, a compound associated with arterial damage when elevated. The East End ate its way through poverty and somehow avoided the heart disease that came with prosperity. Number 3 is haricot bean and ham hock stew, eaten nationwide from the 1930s through the early 1950s, documented in rationing-era household economy guides as a meal requiring patience but rewarding it completely. A smoked ham hock, 6pence or slightly less at market stalls, went into an earthenware pot with dried haricot beans soaked overnight, a bay leaf, and enough water to cover generously. The beans absorbed the stock across 3 hours of low cooking, tripling the volume of the meal and drawing the flavor of the hock into every layer. The fat rendered slowly into the liquid and was lifted from the surface before serving, leaving a broth rich in taste and lean in saturated fat per portion. Haricot beans carry one of the most studied soluble fiber profiles in British nutritional research. Tinned baked beans in tomato sauce replaced this meal in the 1960s. The can had sugar, the stew had none. Number 2 is kippers with brown bread from the smokehouses of Craster in Northumberland, Whitby on the Yorkshire coast, and Arbroath in Scotland, where generations of smoking families refined a cold smoking process that preserved the full fatty acid profile of the herring in a way that high-heat cooking cannot replicate. A pair of kippers cost 2p in the 1930s. Eaten alongside brown bread on an enamel plate, they delivered the highest omega-3 concentration available in any fish in the British dietary tradition. Cold smoking does not oxidize the long-chain fatty acids responsible for cardiovascular benefit, meaning the kipper arrived at the table with its protective mechanisms entirely intact. Smokehouse trade records from Whitby and Craster document a steady and then collapsing market across the post-war decades. The kipper did not disappear because something nutritionally superior replaced it. It disappeared because convenience had become its own argument and because the generation raised on supermarkets had decided it was embarrassing. And then at number 1 is porridge and buttermilk. The threshold meal, the foundational dish, the one that held its ground the longest and fell the hardest. Coarse oatmeal, cooked slowly in water with a pinch of salt and nothing else, served in a wooden bowl with cold buttermilk poured alongside, not mixed in but kept separate so that the probiotic cultures arrived at the table alive. Scottish crofting families and Northern English households maintained this meal through the Depression and rationing years and into the 1950s, when school porridge programs documented in Scottish Education Authority records still served versions of it to children before the morning began. Then the post-war shift in domestic science curricula began its quiet and systematic work, removing pulse cookery, offal preparation, grain-based daily meals and traditional fermented dairy from school syllabuses within a single decade. The larder, that north-facing, stone-shelved, naturally cooled room that had made every meal on this list possible, was removed from British Council House design specifications in the same years, replaced first by a refrigerator alcove and then by nothing at all. The knowledge was not lost in a single catastrophic moment. It was untaught, course by course, kitchen by kitchen, house plan by house plan. The beta-glucan in the oats, the live probiotic cultures in the buttermilk, and the complete absence of added sugar. These 3 mechanisms working simultaneously made this the single most comprehensively heart-protective meal in the Depression-era British dietary tradition, confirmed across multiple independent lines of nutritional research. Every other meal on this list was forgotten by accident, displaced by convenience or economics or the slow pressure of a food industry with no interest in meals that cost 6p and required no packaging. This one was abandoned by choice as a deliberate signal that the era it belonged to was over. Somewhere on a shelf in a house built before the war, a glass Kilner jar sits sealed, a measure of coarse oatmeal visible through the glass. The lid has not been opened in years. The coal range it once served beside has been gone for 6 decades. The kitchen is quiet. The jar remains,